So let me open it up to some questions and then just and go from there.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. Right here, in the middle.
All right.
How you doing?
Hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, so obviously, great speech, and it's great to have you here. One thing that I've noticed is that given all the bubbles and all the regulations and all the government's crackdown on business in all the wrong sectors, obviously that didn't stop you from doing really well. And obviously, I assume that you contribute a good amount of your education for it. So I guess since you're speaking to a lot of students, as flawed as their education is, what would you recommend they focus a solid amount of time on if they want to do something very similar to what you did?
Well, I think it's always hard for me to give career advice to 1,000 people at once, and it's hard to do it in a way that's honest, because I don't think it can't possibly be the same thing for everybody, and so you have to. Narrow thing is, you have to realize that we have some crazy bubbles going on. It's probably not a good time to go work for the government. If that's the government bubble, you should probably avoid that one sector. But I would say the interview question that I always like to ask people, which is a really, people find to be a really tough one to answer, is something along the lines of, what do you believe is true that almost nobody agrees with you on? And that's probably a good starting point to find something that's valuable and is undervalued, and where you can approach it with your life. Whereas if you ask the standard answer we're sort of brainwashed to give is that truth is all social, that truth is determined by what other people think, and that you should simply do what everybody says you should do. And I think that I don't think you should. Don't be a lemming, don't be a sheep, just be a human being, or something like that. But I would say that's the question I would start with, and in some ways, they did these studies at Harvard Business School a few years ago, where they found that people always went into the exact wrong area, and they you had sort of this hothouse environment where nobody had any opinions. They were all extroverted. You put them in one place, and after sort of 2 years, they all concluded they should basically all do the same thing, and sort of almost always turned out to be the wrong thing. So sort of in the late 80s, they all tried to work for Michael Milken just before he went to jail, and 99, they never wanted to do anything in tech except 99, just when that was about to end. They all tried to go into real estate in 05, and so you need to try to ask the question very, very differently, I think.
Center of the room again? Yeah, it's the only mic. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking tonight. My name is Pericles. I'm with the Executive Board with Students for Liberty. The question I wanted to ask revolves around that bubble creation. And, we can assume that the internet bubble, or, the internet boom, kind of bailed out Keynesian policies that would have maybe tanked or contributed to further economic woe earlier in the 20th century. So my question is, what do you think the likelihood is that maybe the next, if we have another 5-10 years of momentum left, do you think that maybe in that time, the next technological boom, be it in energy or maybe healthcare, could again bail out their policies and maybe make their own policies irrelevant after a while?
Yeah, no, I think the question about Keynesian economics is always strange, because there's something about the whole thing that seems fraudulent, where you sort of are printing money, and that somehow creates economic wealth. And I think people, in most other times in history, would have thought this was just a bizarre, crazy thing to do. It was there was the earliest bubbles in the history of the world were the Mississippi and South Sea bubbles, both in 1720. The Mississippi bubble was driven by this guy, John Law, who sort of came up with this idea that you could get rid of the gold standard, you could print fiat money, and you could create this great boom. And it was a boom and then a bust. And after that, no one wanted to talk about fiat money again for like 200 years. And I think France was sort of one of the last countries to go off the gold standard. Didn't really do it till 38 or 39. But obviously, there was something about the Keynes thing that seems just fraudulent, and yet we also have to acknowledge that somehow it seemed to work for many decades. And so the people who said that Keynesian economics in the 30s would immediately go bust, and that all the government borrowing wouldn't work, it kind of managed to work for a number of decades. I would say it's just because you had this incredible technological tailwind. And if you have a big technological tailwind, it will power many economically delusional ideas for some time. Now, I think I would say that the first cut on it is that the tailwind, I think, is not really quite there anymore, and that's why Keynesianism produces nothing but bubbles. I think there was some innovation around the internet in the 90s. I don't think it was enough to create sustainable growth. Housing even less so, government even less so. And the problem on some level is not a macroeconomic problem. Again, the macroeconomic question is how much money should the government print? And I don't want to say that's an unimportant question, but I think the non-macroeconomic question is, again, what should you do? And that's the individual libertarian way to frame it. And I think we need to de-emphasize macroeconomics, which was itself a Keynesian concept. It was that the economy was not the sum of its parts. It was somehow this holistic thing that exists above the sum of its parts. And maybe that's true. Maybe there are different layers to things on some level. And if you're suffering from cancer, the reductionist thing is you do chemo. The non-reductionist thing is you do yoga. In practice, you should do both. I'll grant that. So if you can do something to restore confidence, that might be good if you are doing everything else. But at a point where we think the only level that exists is the macroeconomic level, it's like you have a cancer patient who's already doing 3 hours of yoga a day, and the recommendation is we need to do more yoga. And so there's something that's gone really wrong with it at this point.
Hi, so I know you've played a major role in the Seasteading Institute, and I was wondering if you could give us an update on the Institute and what can young advocates for liberty do to assist the Institute? Thank you.
Well, the Seasteading Institute, for people who don't know, is trying to, one of the questions we've always asked is, what can be done to create new societies, new countries to start over? Because if you could start over, you might do things very differently. There's a constraint because most of the land is occupied by existing governments, and so there's a question, is there something you could do by claiming territory on the ocean, either on a boat or on a platform, or things of that sort. And so we've basically funded this as sort of a somewhat out-of-the-box initiative. I think it's raised a lot of great philosophical questions about the nature of government. The one that the one that I think is always important that Patrick Friedman, the head of the Seasteading Institute, I'm sort of channeling him here now, likes to raise is what's more important, voice or exit? And in most companies, you have no voice, but you have exit. So if you go to Starbucks, you don't actually run the company. But if you don't like the coffee, you can go across the street to a different coffee shop. If you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, the people work for you. So, they're appointed by people who are appointed by people who are appointed by people who you elected. But you have no exit. You will have voice but no exit with the DMV. You have exit but no voice with Starbucks. Our sort of general pro-political bias is that voice is much more important than exit. And the question I think that's always worth raising is there a point where exit is more important than voice? And certainly the state governments and municipal governments in the US are much less screwed up than the federal government because people can move to different states. There's still a decent amount of competition that happens on a state-by-state or city-by-city basis, much less on the federal basis. And so I think the idea of creating some competition between governments is one of the most critical things that one can do. One of the things the Seasteading group of people have organized is an annual event called Ephemeral. It's sort of like Burning Man on boats in the Sacramento River Delta, and so it probably it's a great place to meet some really cool people who would have a lot of answers to the question of what do you think is true that nobody agrees with.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kaluza from the University of Texas at San Antonio. My question is regarding empowerment. We're at a Students for Liberty conference, and all of us here, 700 minimum, I don't even know what we're at right now, but we all could, one day become the next Peter Thiel. And I'd love to see that. I'd love to see 20 Peter Thiels or 100 Peter Thiels. So what would you say led you to get your start in becoming an entrepreneur and becoming what you are now today?
Yeah, I'm always sort of weak on the autobiographical stuff, but I think that I think the starting point has to be this question of what you want to do. And I know I sort of went to undergrad, I went to law school, I worked for a few years on Wall Street as a lawyer for 7 months and 3 days, and then as a for a bank, and I think I think sort of the emotional driver on my end was that I didn't want my life to simply be interchangeable with that of many other people, where it was just another cog in the machine. And I don't think that's necessarily something everybody has to have as a view for their life, but that was something I felt very intensely. And that then got me to thinking about what are ways to do things differently. I ended up back in Silicon Valley. There were a number of friends that I had that were in the process of starting companies, and it was sort of a natural thing that happened in that context. But I think sort of the philosophical starting point, I would say, is just do you think your life should simply be a repeat of the lives that have been led by many other people, or do you want to try to do something unique and different that has not been done before? And I think there's a lot to be said for giving the latter a try. And if you're young, this is the time to do it.
I'm Brian Cohen from Drexel University. I have a question. Well, PayPal was started on crypto-anarchist principles. The idea that the mathematics of public key cryptography and technologies such as computers and the internet could level borders and provide like a new frontier. Now, 14 years later, PayPal is nearly fully integrated with the financial system, and it kind of like deviated from like its original goals, because it was kind of as a centralized entity, it was sort of pressured by the banks or by the regulators, but now we have technologies like Tor, which allows anonymized routing, and technologies such as Bitcoin, which you probably have heard of. What do you think about the prospects of not necessarily just Bitcoin, the first online peer-to-peer cyber currency, and technologies like it?
Yes, all right, let's see, so much I can give a whole long speech on this question. So I did, yes, I think shifting to the creation of a full-fledged new currency is a non-trivial thing to do. I remember giving a speech in '99, November '99. It was at a libertarian event in Silicon Valley. And the title of the speech was "Strong Crypto, Smart Cell Phones, and the End of Monetary Sovereignty." And sort of how there's going to be this confluence between technology and it would somehow shift the ability of governments to dictate the value of money. I think we are still on a trajectory where this is going to happen. It is probably, I think you have to sort of keep in mind that there are many governments that are still much worse than the U.S. as a starting point, and so I think we can I think there's probably some very interesting ways in which mobile phone technology in African countries could be used to basically keep your currency in the cloud, where it's not really clear where it resides. So if you're in Zimbabwe and you have a cell phone, do you need to have the $100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar note, or can you just have the money residing on a server in the cloud? So I think there's something about some of these technologies that may start to happen in the years ahead. I don't know if you need, however, to create a fully alternate currency to really shift the balance quite a bit. And the thing I would underscore is that you can have things where the form stays the same, but the substance has really shifted. And with currency, the standard prop I always had when I was running PayPal, was giving speeches, you sort of hold up a $100 bill, and it's always sort of very hypnotic, get people's attention. And it's like, would the gentleman in the front row like to have the $100 bill? Why would you like to have it? And it's because there's something around currency which has this network-like effect, and it works because other people value it. And when you ask, why is this thing so valuable? It's just a piece of paper. It's probably not very hygienic. It probably, you wouldn't even want to use it as toilet paper or wallpaper. It's sort of not really backed by anything. And so there's something extremely mysterious about the nature of money. And to the extent the government has unlimited power to print more, there's something sort of very fundamentally shaky about it. I think the idea of having a fully functioning payment system is to create a world in which people can easily exchange their currency for other currency. And if you do that, even if it stays substantively the same, it actually becomes very hard for governments to inflate. And even in this whole recent crisis of the last 3-4 years, there's so far not been major inflation, because if there is, people would just easily be able to move from one currency into another. And in this way, we're in a world that's very different from the 40s or 50s or 60s, where it was illegal for people in the US to hold other currency. It was illegal to even hold gold till 1971. And so I think if you create technologies that make money easily convertible and interchangeable, that actually plays a very strong role in changing the nature of money. The Queen of England is still the sovereign of the British Commonwealth, but if you're a chicken farmer in Ghana and your neighbor steals your chicken, you would not take your appeal to Buckingham Palace. So the forms can stay very much the same, the substance can shift quite a bit, and I think something like that's happened with money. The challenge with creating alternate currencies is it's very hard to get the network effect going. And my own theory would be the only kind of place you could create an alternate network effect, if you really wanted to create an alternate currency, would be for it to be gold-based, because that's something where I think there are enough people who already believe in gold that you could probably get it to a tipping point. Starting something completely different from scratch, I think is very hard to do. Anyway, I'd have a lot more thoughts on it, but I'd say you want to go with gold.
Hey, I'm Charles Corallo. You said alternative energies were a bad investment. In perfect libertarianism, there's respect for property rights, and many economists such as Walter Block have said that if we had property rights for the last 100 years, which we haven't had perfect property rights, we would not even be using oil today, and we would have had another alternative to that currency. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think well, energy is an incredibly regulated market. 90% of the energy is produced by governments. It's mostly corrupt governments in the emerging world, and so I think I think there's obviously a great deal of a very intense regulation. Probably even a lot of alternate energy can't be developed for regulatory reasons. So I think it's a classic case of massive regulation, massive lack of property rights.
Good evening, Mr. Thiel. My name is Shai. So I have a question on how do you think the libertarian government will redefine international relations? So I was just really curious because on one hand, I think I'm one of the few people in this room where I'm from China, like one of the countries where most of the people, as well as authority, is like against or don't identify with or oppress the libertarian movement. But in spite of that, I'm still here. So, but on the other hand, I'm also a big fan of system. I want to work for that for my life. So I'm just really curious about how do you think the start of this kind of an individual enterprise type of government will play? What kind of role it will play in this new international relations? Because I'm just a little bit nervous. Like, I want to work in CSTAC, but I don't want to be betrayed from my country. Like, my grandpa would not like that. Yes, thank you.
Yes, well, you know, there is always, you know, one of the challenges, you know, one of the things government does probably do is protect you from other governments that are worse, and so this is always a sort of the philosophic question you have to answer is how much is that protection real? How much is it imaginary? You know, and probably if you sort of generalize, all forms of state violence are always rationalized as ways to reduce violence. And so it's never just that the government likes killing people, even if that might be the truth. But it's, and that, you know, it's not that you have these mentally ill people who like doing this or something like that. That's not the way it's described. It's always rationalized as the violence is always done in a way where it's, you know, designed to limit violence and to be sort of humane and peaceful and create a better world. You know, I think the guillotine in France was originally, you know, was invented as a humanitarian device because, you know, people before that had their heads chopped off with an axe and they might miss your head or stuff, and so guillotine was seen as a massive humanitarian improvement. And so I think the question we have to always ask is, you know, how much of this is real, how much is fake, and you can sort of, I think people can reasonably come down on somewhat different levels. I tend to think that the threat of government violence has been greatly exaggerated, and for that reason we could have a significantly more libertarian system and not worry about it. There obviously are, you know, there are all these corner cases that are very tough that I don't have all the answers for, but I think at the margins it's been greatly exaggerated.
Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for coming. My name is Andre Grion. You touched on some of these ideas before, voice but no exit, and then your commentary on currency. I'd like to ask you specifically on your view concerning Friedrich Hayek's contention that we should have a free market in currency in his manuscript, Choice in Currency, which is followed by his longer book, Denationalization of Currency. Do you think that's a proposition worth supporting and advocating for us libertarians? You know, you mentioned that we have choice now, we can go to other currencies, but they're all other government currencies. So do you think that's something that we should support, is a free market in currency?
Well, yes, although, you know, the other side of it was, I believe the other side of that debate was always Milton Friedman, who argued that the currency rates should be fixed by government, and that government shouldn't be allowed to have a free market because then it would simply inflate. And so the thing that's very weird about the currency question is, yes, in theory you want a free market in currency. On the other hand, if the government itself can print more money, that sort of begs the most important question. And so the Friedman argument was that having a fixed exchange rate would force the governments to not devalue their currencies, whereas if you had a floating one, that made room for more government malfeasance. So you have sort of this, it again goes back to this very weird question of the nature of money itself. The way I would try to sort of cut the Gordian knot between having fixed versus floating currency rates would be to say that, again, don't think it should be thought of as simply a macroeconomic thing, but it should be thought of as much more a matter of contract and a microeconomic thing. And so, you know, if I had to sort of identify, like in the 30s, there were all these things that sort of, you know, went insanely wrong. Probably the single sort of, there's sort of one whole thread that was, I think, very underrated, was the series of Supreme Court cases in which they struck down the gold clause that people used to have in contracts. So you used to have a contract where the contract said, you know, I'm going to pay you $20, but you can also choose to get an ounce of gold. And as long as you had a gold clause in the contract, it didn't really matter whether the government had a fixed or floating currency. You could basically, it was sort of forced to be on a gold standard through this whole informal set of contracts. And basically after they broke the gold standard in '33 and made it illegal for people to hold gold, there was still this question, what do you do with these gold clauses that existed in almost every contract you had in the US? There was sort of I think it was probably one of the most important of the New Deal Supreme Court decisions was in 1935, when you had sort of a 5-4 majority, basically said that the contracts clause would be struck down. We're going to ignore this one case of gold. And so I think you just need to be able to enforce contracts. And you need to be able to go back to a society in which people would have the option to contract for gold or any other medium of exchange. And if you had contract rights, I think you'd move beyond the debate whether currencies should be fixed or floating.
So you would support Google coming out with their own currency then if it was legal?
Well, yes, I would support people trying to do it. I'm not sure you can easily create a new currency, because if you go back to my $100 bill example, and that's why I think if you're going to do something, you probably have to do it with gold.
Right, exactly. I agree. Okay, thank you, Peter.
Hi, Peter. I just wanted to say, first of all, it was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing with all of us. I really enjoyed it. But my question to you is, one of the themes you brought up in your speech was how technology can be used as a tool of liberation and advancement for society. And I think every single one of us in this room would agree that WikiLeaks is one such tool that has been used to expose government corruption and generally advance the cause of freedom. So my question to you was, if I recall correctly, a couple years ago, that when people were donating to WikiLeaks through PayPal, PayPal decided to freeze the donations from those accounts, and I was wondering how you reconcile that decision with your previous comments on technology is using to advance the cause of freedom.
Let's see. My first sort of disclaimer would be that I'm no longer involved with PayPal and have not been involved with them since 2002. But if I had to sort of give the more honest account of this, it probably is the case that if I was running PayPal, we would still feel compelled to make the same decision that the people made and that the people at Amazon made. And you'd sort of talk, in practice, you'd end up talking a good game about how you're not going to buckle into the government and you're going to respect people's, all sorts of people's rights, but then you have sort of all these tentacles and hooks into you, and you'd end up probably caving in every case. So it's sort of like, what I think is true of the way we negotiate with terrorists is also true of the way companies negotiate with governments, where what happens is that we never compromise except in every specific instance. And so that's, I think that is, and so when you look at PayPal or Amazon or Visa or all the various people, the question you have to ask is, were they doing it because this was actually a deeply felt ideological thing on the part of the companies that they should do this, or because the government had its screws on them? And so the sort of there's sort of this liberal / libertarian argument that the companies are bad and not to be trusted, and I tend to think one needs to put it really against this backdrop of insane regulation. The average person in the U.S. commits 3 felonies a day, and we can start investigating you if you don't behave yourself properly. So that is sort of the background context that one is operating in, and one has to be aware that it limits what one can do.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Robert Dorsey. I'm from Florida Gulf Coast University, and I'm going to pull us back a little bit. You spoke about education, and my question is fairly simple. is it worth for the federal government to continue to provide essentially endless school loans to every student who wants them? There's very little requirements for them.
Yeah, well, I suspect that there's a certain way the answer that question should go, and I think obviously it needs to be rethought a great deal. There's sort of many strange things going on with education, how education works, what people think is going on. The striking thing is I think it is almost all about credentialing and very little is about learning. And I can say that. I think there is this, and there is there are problems with it. People, having a college degree is valuable. It is a credential that helps you. If you don't have it, you may be worse off in our society. And so, there's sort of crazy ways in which people are stuck. But if we had a strong government, if we had a government that's able to act responsibly, you'd have a government that would actually counteract these bubbles. And so, the correct thing to do in the tech bubble in '96 would have been for Alan Greenspan to massively raise rates. He had one brief moment of courage in December of '96 when he said there was irrational exuberance. Within a few days, he had given up on that because of the outcry, and the bubble went on for 3 more years. In the housing bubble, 2005, it was George Bush. It was sort of the Opportunity Society. The Democrats it was racial discrimination if you were trying to say anything against the housing bubble because minorities should own houses as well. And so at the peak of the bubble, the government sort of exacerbated them even more and strengthened them even more. And if we had a role for government, it should be to act counter-cyclically and not exacerbate these bubbles. And so the test for government is, since we have an education bubble going on today, it would be which political leaders are courageous enough to say that the government should actively discourage people from this and sort of go against the crazy mob psychology that is at work. Or is the government simply an expression of the mob and sort of in a way an intensified version of it, where it can actually intensify the sort of psychosocial dynamic? And I think the latter is true, which is why I think the cure to these bubbles can't be the government. Of course, once they're broken, the government wants to regulate stuff. So, once the internet bubble broke, we got Sarbanes-Oxley. Once the finance bubble broke, you get the Dodd-Frank bill. But that's sort of like, that's basically, locking the barn door well after the horse has left the barn, or something like that. And I'm sure that, once the education bubble breaks, we're going to have lots of investigations into subprime schools and all sorts of things like that are going on. But at the point when something needs to be done, it's basically pouring more and more fuel on the fire. So it's a very sorry spectacle.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Radwin from Canisius College in Buffalo, New York. You spoke very briefly about deregulating biotechnology, but when you make a pharmaceutical that's bad, you kill people. So it's a fundamental of government to protect the people. So where do you draw the line between quality of life and deregulation?
Well, it's there's actually a question who should decide, and I think that in many cases, if you're a late stage cancer patient, if you have Alzheimer's, things like that, maybe it makes sense to take a great deal of risk on these things. There are detailed questions about what kinds of standards we should have. When we have double-blind testing, that implicitly is a government standard that says we have a certain view of science. It says science is purely empirical, but the empiricism has to happen in a very narrow, specific way. You can't, for example, have drugs that just work. If you had a drug that just cured people, it wouldn't be good enough. You still have to have a placebo test in which you give the drug to 1,000 people who have the disease to prove the double-blind test. So there certainly are all sorts of ways things have been set up that it's not at all clear how this is going. If you count it in terms of numbers of people who have been killed, my sense would be that it's massively on the other side of the ledger. That relatively few of these drugs are all that dangerous. A great number of them have simply not been created. And there's always just this failure of imagination of what could have been done, what technology could have happened. And my own view is that it's not like, and this goes again goes to sort of this larger question about what's the technological possibility set that exists in our society, and I think it's actually very big. I mean, that's why I'm both like optimistic about technological possibility and angry about the way in which it's been stopped by government. If I thought that all the low-hanging fruit's been picked and there's nothing new that can be invented and the patent office should be closed because it's nothing but useless junk that's getting created at this point, then you might want to have much higher regulatory things. You have to make some of these background assumptions. But I think the problem is most of these people are, they're not really. The rewards are very asymmetric. If you're an FDA regulator, you don't get paid if a drug actually works. You only get punished if something goes through that doesn't work. And if you look at the incentives, the balance is probably skewed very badly one way.
Hi, Michael McLean. I had a question on your thoughts regarding voting theory and non-standard voting systems, both regarding the Seasteading Institute and also pertaining to sort of its nature as a method of achieving collective intelligence, relating to what you're talking about the stagnation of technological discovery in certain areas despite the profitability of research there. While standing in line, I was thinking of whether to give an example or rhetorical question to help explain my question. I'm thankful I did because I think you have an answer to my rhetorical question.
So give me this. I didn't understand the second part of your question. I'm sorry.
The use of like non-standard voting systems other than what we currently use, like in everyday life, and its ability to sort of capitalize on collective intelligence. My example that I was going to give would be how a computer chip is the ratio of intelligence of, say, a computer chip to a transistor is much greater than, say, the human race with regards to solving any sort of technological problem relative to an individual human.
Yes, well, there probably are, there probably are many different voting systems you could have. There are many different ways to experiment with it. I'm not, but what I would suggest is that we, I'm sort of skeptical of how much voting actually works in the first place. There's sort of a pessimistic and optimistic libertarian version of this sort of, when I was in, I used to think that it was really important to try to, directly change the political system, convince people of things, and you have these debates about things, and I still think it's intellectually very interesting and very important. I think occasionally you do get some converts that way, but it's really an inefficient way to go about doing things. And one of the things I like about technology is that when technology is unregulated, you can work on changing the world without getting approval from other people. And so there is sort of an aspect of technology that's, at its best, it is not subject to democratic control and not subject to the majority, which I think will often be somewhat hostile to change and often doesn't want things to be different from the way they are. I would say, but yes, I think I think we have, we always have, so many of our debates are about, who's going to win this election, what are they going to do, and there's sort of a degree to which it's all just very comic. I was, in 2008 in Silicon Valley, they were trying to round up, the Obama campaign was trying to round up a number of prominent tech people to support them. I was more on the Republican side, but more libertarian, so I was sort of a swing person they thought they might be able to get. And they got, I think they got about 90% of the people on the list. And my own analysis was, well, I'm not sure I can influence it enough. It'll be, there's so many, there's all these things with the economy. I don't agree with what they're going to do. There's 68 people they already have. I can maybe influence it more if I'm one of the 7 people they don't have. But I think in retrospect, it's like those 68 people had very little influence. The people who voted for Obama had very little influence. The people who voted for Bush or McCain or whatever. It doesn't, you know, they sort of, you can sort of project your fantasies onto political leaders, but very rarely will those actually be realized. I'm not categorically against voting, against politics. I think there is, you know, things can be better or worse at the margin, and it's, you know, it's worth it for people to be, you know, somewhat engaged in these things, but it's always unhealthy for this to be the dominant focus, and you just end up being very depressed.
I'm Peter as well. I want to, despite what you just said, I really want to tell you I appreciate, I'm sure a lot of people here appreciate you stepping up for Ron Paul and Endorse Liberty. And then I used to always butter up my teachers before I, you know, wanted to correct them. But you said something about the, well, these bubbles are caused by the government printing money. But I want to ask you, if the government can print as much money as it wants or needs, why is it in debt? And I think we've heard through the mainstream media that the government's printing the money, but what do you really believe that, or are you open to consider that maybe we have a private cartel that's actually printing the money and exchanging it for debt from both the government, but in the larger part from the private sector? And I actually am issuing alternative currencies. Thanks.
Well, there certainly are many levels on which one can question what's going on in our government. You know, I think I think the sort of conspiracy theory of history. You know, there's a lot to be said for that sort of approach to thinking about things. It forces you to think about what are the motives people have, what's the intentionality, what's really going on, and it pushes you to ask a great number of questions that you might not otherwise ask. And sometimes it leads you to very interesting places. You know, so if the conspiracy theory of the JFK assassination, for example, points out that, well, there was all this crazy stuff going on with the government. There was the mafia. There was some crazy stuff with, you know, there's so many different people who had the goods on JFK that it was, you know, that's what gave the conspiracy theories a lot of credence. Even though at the end of the day, I still believe it was just Oswald who killed JFK. And I think in a similar way, I'm generally skeptical of conspiracy theories because I think that the people running the government are not really capable of conspiracy at this point.
The question was, if the government's printing the money, then why do they have any debt? That was the really question. I don't know.
Well, they haven't printed enough yet. I mean, they basically they're piling up. They're basically printing the money about as fast as they're piling up new debt. That's sort of the first cut answer on that.
Mr. Thiel, thank you very much. Audience, thank you for the wonderful questions. We're out of time for this evening's event. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.